Today on Time We Discuss, I have Joe Lukins with me. Joe, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Absolutely. So, Joe, my understanding, you're a sports psychologist, which in my head, I'm thinking sports strategy, and I wasn't a sports person as a kid, so that's kind of where my knowledge ends. So let's talk about this. What does a sports psychologist actually do? What's your typical day like?
Well, my typical day is quite varied, but in terms of what sports psychology looks like as a profession, it's a bespoke version of psychology, if you like. So, the field of sports psychology changed a lot. The timing was quite good for me actually when I was an undergraduate student, because the field of psychology started to ask the question about what would happen if we studied what's right with people. That for hundreds of years, psychology had really importantly focused on when people are challenged or struggling, how can we help? But then it turned its attention to, well, when people are trying to achieve or be successful, what does that look like? So I guess essentially my role is that I help athletes and teams to think in a way that helps enhance their performance and enhance their lives. Because of course we know that athletes, when they're not doing their sport, are humans as well. So they have all the challenges that any other human might have. So my role at the individual level with an athlete will be about helping them with their thinking around their sport, but then it might also be about helping them with some of their life stuff as well. So I might work with athletes individually. I really love working with teams and with coaches, because obviously coaches are at the pointy end of the team, if you like. They're influencing far more players. I won't necessarily work with every player in a team. So I love working with coaches. I love coaches who are open to feedback, because obviously that's what I can offer from my expertise. So I might be working with teams, working with athletes. I have a teaching position at the university, and I also work in sort of a consulting space. So I do quite a work. You've probably picked up from my accent that I'm in Australia. So for your audience, but I work with the Australian Defence Force in terms of their performance enhancement as well. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm writing books.
Wow, that is awesome and fascinating. So when I think of like a psychologist or a therapist, I think, someone's having for lack of better words, issues they're trying to resolve. Okay. How
Mm.
does that work with the sports psychology? Does like the coach approach you on behalf of a player? Or how does that begin?
They might do. So I guess it depends on how any individual who might be looking for assistance, how comfortable they might feel with the area of sports psychology. So I've worked in the profession for over 30 years. So I've seen a whole generational shift in terms of people's engagement with sports psychology. So when I first started, players would sort of not, they'd bow their heads as they walked past in the corridors, and, weren't sure if I was going to read their minds, or all sorts of crazy things that they thought that I might be able to do, which I haven't decided if that would be a superpower or not. But certainly in terms of, I mean, what I do with the teams that I work with, I hopefully have developed rapport with players that they can just approach me. Depends on the setup that I have with the team. But a player might approach me and say, "Hey, Joe, I want to work on this aspect." There might be something really specific about their game. They might have been making some consistent errors, perhaps. And then they might say, now I'm thinking about it a lot, and before the game I'm thinking about it, and I know that's not helpful for me, and I want to get that out of my head. It might be something like that. Or I might have an athlete who is coming back from injury. So I actually did my PhD in sports psychology and looked at the psychology and injury. So, a player might say, well, look, I've been out for 9 months with an ACL injury, and now when I think about going back, I'm excited, but I'm a bit nervous as well. Can we talk about that? Or I might have an athlete who's just been, like I've got athletes who are gearing up for the Olympics for this year. I've got, all over, that are just going, how can I be at my mental best? What's the mental edge that I can have in terms of performance? So it's really quite varied.
Wow, wow. There's again just so fascinating. So fascinating. I had no idea that such a career opportunity existed. That is so cool. So how did you find your way into this path? Because when I first discovered you, this is the first time I ever heard of this. So how did you stumble across this? How did you get started?
I started by accident, as all good careers do, I think. So I actually, as a high school student, I thought that I wanted to join the police service. So I live in a state of Australia called Queensland. So I thought I wanted to join the Queensland Police Service. long story short, I was about 16. My parents took me to the academy on a careers night. And by chance, I always refer to it as my sliding doors moment. I don't know if you remember the movie that Gwyneth Paltrow was in years ago about sliding doors.
Yes.
So I was just walking across the campus with my mum, and a police officer was coming in the opposite direction and stopped me and just said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm coming to join the police force." And he said, "Well, what degree are you going to do first?" And I said, "I didn't think you had to do a degree to join the police force, and you didn't." But he looked at me and he said, "Well, you do." Because I probably looked about 12 at the time. And it was turned out to be such good advice. And I just said to him in passing, I said, "Well, what sort of degree should I do?" And he said, "Oh, something to do with people. Good luck." And then he kept going. So from that moment, I went back to school and I talked to my guidance officer, and he said, "What about psychology?" And I said, "Well, that sounds like people." And then I found myself in a northern regional town in Queensland, where I did my degree. And then luckily for the people in my town, I'd forgotten about being a police officer by the time I finished my degree. I'd always enjoyed sport. And then in Australia, a really big sport is the sport of rugby league, which is a football code. And a new national team came to our town. So round about the time I graduated. So sort of the stars all lined up. I got myself an opportunity to be interviewed by the coach. I got that position. I worked with that club for 26 years on the in the National League. And so I now work within our sport of rugby league across the country. And I work with one of the women's teams as well. I work in basketball as well. We used to have a men's national team here in my town, which sadly we don't have anymore, but we have a women's team. So I worked with them for 10 years. Then I now work with another team in another part of the country. And I also work with the PNG Orchids, which is the women's national rugby league team from Papua New Guinea. And Papua New Guinea, it's an amazing country. It's the only one in the world that has rugby league as its national sport. And you've never met more parochial fans. So that's kind of the areas that I work in.
So you mentioned all those different sports that you were involved with. Do you ever, or does someone in your position ever travel with specific teams, or not so much?
Yes, so it can involve travel. I mean, the aim with an individual athlete is to have them independent of me, if you like. So we want to build their psychological skills so that they can travel anywhere, compete everywhere. I had an athlete just this last week who was competing in Europe. Would have been very nice to go with that athlete to Europe, but I didn't get to go on that particular trip. So you want athletes to be independent. But what I do, so with the Orchids as an example, the PNG women's national team, traveled with them in 2022 to the World Cup in England. So I was an integral part of their team, because for that team, I was the first sports psychologist to ever work with the team. And I also held a dual role. So in addition to sports psychology, I also was the wellbeing manager for the team. So, half of our players came from the highlands of Papua New Guinea, had never even traveled to Australia before, which is sort of a 2-hour flight. So here we were in winter, flying to England, staying in a hotel. Every aspect of living was literally foreign for these athletes. So we needed to help support them with that, support them with their managing their relationships at home. They were being paid money. They had an income for the first time in their lives. Some of our players, English was their second language. So there was a lot going on, Dan. It was a busy time. So when you get to do travel like that, it is such a privilege to do it. But it was certainly for me professionally one of the most challenging and most rewarding things I've ever done.
Is this a growing profession, or is it no, it's kind of status quo, and there are a number of people in different organizations out there. What's your take on that? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that when you're fortunate enough to gain a position with a team, and the thing with elite sport is it's a tough profession. So you can be cut, coaches can be cut, players can be cut, sports psychs can be cut as well. So, for example, the North Queensland Cowboys, which is the team that I worked with here, I was their sports psych for 26 years. So I wasn't going in, it wasn't until I decided to sort of move on. So the challenge can be getting your foot in there. And what I typically say to new graduates who are looking for opportunities is what I did very early on is I volunteered my time. I went in at the sub-elite or the local level for teams. I still work with some local teams, some local athletes as well. And what I think the other thing that has a big impact on it, so in Australia, we had the Sydney Olympics in 2000 and sports psychology boomed in the lead up to the Sydney Olympics, and then government funding drained and it kind of, the number of programs decreased. So I'd say that and we have the Olympics coming to Australia in 2032. So I would expect it to boom again. So I would say to people interested in the profession, it's a bit of a long game, but certainly if you're in a region that is being supported by a significant sports event, like an Olympics or like a World Cup in a sport, there might be potential there as well. So I think teams and sports understand the mental game is important, whatever the sport might be. But I think what also it takes in sports psychology, depending where you are and depending what you do, you might need to be a little bit flexible in your own thinking as a professional as to how your skills can be utilised, which is why I found myself, I've been working for the last 10 years with the Australian Defence Force, delivering sports psychology, but I just have to badge it differently, frame it differently. The sports examples, certainly there's an appetite for that within defence, but also being a soldier is very different to being an athlete in some ways as well.
That makes sense. Now, Joe, let me ask you this. If someone is already a psychologist in some capacity, they're, a therapist in some capacity or something like that, how easy would it be for that person to transition to be a sports psych? Are there completely different skill sets? Would they need to go back and get more education? Can they leverage what they already know? What does that look like?
It's certainly an excellent foundation to start with because essentially at its essence, psychology is curious about people and how we think. So depending on your adaptability around that would probably influence it. And I guess psychology pays a lot of attention to how professionals describe themselves. So, for example, the legislation in the United States would be different to England, which would be different to Australia. And even within Australia, I know different states have different requirements. So for some, the title sports psychologist may not even get used in some places. So, I will often just refer to myself as, I'm a sports psychology consultant, which is a different way of framing it. But I think it's certainly, sport is a unique setting. So if a professional is able to gain some training in a sports setting, I think that definitely helps. Some might come in with a background. They might come in with a Bachelor of Sport and Exercise Science degree, or they might come in with some other sort of background. And certainly there are postgraduate programs in master's and PhD level at many universities around the world. I think there's only 3 or 4 now in Australia, where there was about 10 when the Olympics came around in 2000. But I probably wouldn't go into it straight off a psychology degree in and of itself, but I think that it's a fantastic place to start.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, what about, you say you work with different sports teams, different types of sports. And I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any difference from your perspective with what you do, working with people from one sport versus another sport?
Yes, so there are differences, but I think it's not so much that the content I deliver is different, but I do often think that, and my experience has been that different sports almost have a different culture about them, and if that makes sense. So there's a stark contrast for me in Australia working with rugby league players, which is very much a blue collar sport. It's a high impact contact sport. And I do remember a day when I had a player from that sport in my office. And immediately after that, I had a player who played in the National Basketball League. And basketball in Australia still has its Australian flavour to it, but it is more Americanized is what it is. So even in terms of how the athletes were sitting in my office, their posture was different, their language was different there. So I find the assistance that athletes needs is generally the same, although there's differences between, say, a high contact sport and one that's less so. But I think, yes, I would agree with your point. There's different cultures within sport. And then you get differences too when you have, say, an individual athlete, like a track athlete. But even if you think about watching, I don't know, Dan, I know you said you don't have a lot of engagement with sport, but if you were watching the Olympics and you were watching track and field, if you can imagine the personas of the 100-meter sprinters, and you think of, all that posturing they often do before a race, and there's a lot of the race that is done before they even get onto the blocks, it's that kind of thing. And then you compare that to the marathon runners, like it's a completely different dynamic, even within the sport of running.
It's interesting. So like that, growing up, I was never a sports person. I was never good at sports. So I never really pursued any really. Just when I was super young, I did, I did soccer, basketball, that sort of
Yeah.
thing, but it
Yeah.
was very, very short lived. And
Yeah.
now my kids are doing sports, and my wife was an athlete. So hearing her talk about, like, you got to get out of your head, like those ideas where it's like, and then hearing you talk about it, it kind of brings all that together. It's very, very fascinating. How important is it, again, from your perspective, how's important that you know stuff about the sports? How's important that you know how basketball works or rugby works and all the intricacies that go with it? How important is that?
It helps, but I've worked in rugby league now for 30 years and I have never played a game of it. So I watch it as a spectator. So I guess one of the things that I'm mindful of is that whenever I'm with any client, and whether that client be the individual athlete, the coach, the team, say, is it's sometimes an advantage for me to not, like, I do not look like an Australian male rugby league player at all. So the advantage of that is what I bring into the room, if you like, is the expertise in terms of psychology, and it allows the athlete, the coach, the team to be the experts in their sport. So it's more of a collaborative kind of working, if you like. And I think that works well because even if, so I played netball for 17 years as a junior, it took me well out of my junior years, didn't it? 17 years. So I have to actually be really careful that when I'm working with netballers, I don't go in with too much assumed knowledge, or I start talking to them about netball, because that's not my expertise. Like, I was a very, very enthusiastic average netballer. So for me to think that I can speak netball in elite terms, but it helps because I know what a centre pass is, and I know what a throw in is, and all those sorts of things. So it helps to educate yourself about the sport. So if they're talking about tackles, if they're talking about turtling them on their back, if they're talking about any of those kind of phrases. So I would always, when I have the opportunity and a coach is open to it, I love to be the fly on the wall. I love to sit in the back of the room while a rugby league spine meeting is happening. So the spine is kind of literally the spine of the team, the key players that sit through the center and make all the decisions, if you like. So if I can sit down the back of the room and listen to their conversations, I pick up on phrases and terms. So I think curiosity is what's helped me with that, and me not pretending to be an expert in football, but an expert in psychology who's interested and curious about football. I think that's what's helped me.
That makes so much sense, so much sense. And like that, just it's something as simple as, hearing those phrases that they use. So when they're talking to you, you can understand what they're saying, and not be completely lost like I would be.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Dan, the other thing that I find is, because my whole role is to see the dynamics and how things are working, I sit down the back of the room as someone who doesn't have, like, I never speak a word. I just sit there quietly with my notepad, but I watch the interactions. I listen to the communication. I sometimes map who's talking and who's not talking. So all of that is useful, particularly then if I might watch a team and then they'll go out and play that week, and then I'll watch what the communication looks like in the game and see if it mirrors what I saw in the meeting. If they were all quiet in the meeting and they're quiet on the field, is there something going on? You can look at those sorts of things. In basketball, I've worked with one coach now. What did we work it out? It's probably 16 years. This might be our 16, maybe this is our 17th year working together. So we've got a very trusted relationship now. So I literally, on the bench, I don't sit on the bench with the players. I sit immediately behind the coach. And I just basically watch him for the game, because if I can help him with what's happening for him, then it then helps the players. But that takes a very courageous coach to do that, because, you have to be open to someone saying, "Hey, Dan, I noticed you did this," and so being open to having that discussion.
Wow, Joe, again, I'm so fascinated by this. This is so, so cool, so different. I love it. Let's switch gears a little bit. So you're also an author. So I'd love to talk to you about your role as an author, how that came to be. So how did you, well, first let's start with this. How many books do you have published currently?
I have 4 published books that I've
Perfect.
written, and my first book was published in 2019.
Okay, let's talk about that. How did that process unfold for your first book?
So that came about, I think, actually, because I was some decades into my career and I'd been doing a lot of individual work with athletes, but I was also doing some individual work with people who weren't athletes. As I mentioned before, I live in a small regional town, and so people would go, "Oh, can I come and see you? You know, I'm interested in sport," and so I did do that, but I hit a saturation point where I thought I need to do something different. And so I'd given a TED talk, which was an amazing opportunity to be able to do that on a particular topic, but it wasn't the topic I wanted to speak on. I wanted to speak about the lessons that I'd learned from elite sport. And I thought, right, I still want to share this information. How can I do it? And I stumbled across a book coach who had a process to help you write a book, because I don't know for many of the audience, but the thought of writing a book when you haven't written one and you don't know how to do it is like, well, that sounds like a lot. And that's why I think there's so many great books that don't get written, because the process seems a little bit intimidating. And that's what it was for me. So I did exactly what happens in my profession. I found a coach who had some expertise, who knew what I had to do. So the irony wasn't lost on me that it took me some time to find someone who was actually doing in the book world what I do in the sport world. And so they coached me through that. So my first book was called Elite in 2019, and it basically translates lessons from elite sport into everyday life, which is what I do in defense and a range of other areas. Then, as we know, the world shut down in 2020. And so a lot of, sports shut down as well. Rugby league continued, and the basketball did in a way, shape and form. But I suddenly had plenty more time on my hands. So I wrote my second book then, which was about a parent's guide for surviving teenage sports. So I'll have to get a copy of that across to you, Dan, with your children coming through their sporting journeys. And then I wrote a journal, and then I've just released Belief, which is a book about, it's a sports psychology book for athletes.
Okay. Now, I've spoken to a number of authors, and they've gone down the traditional publishing route, and others have gone down the self-publishing route. So which road did you take, or did you take both of them at different times?
No, I'm an independent published author. So the first time, that's because that was how I was going to get that first book out. And to be honest, I found the book coach before I even thought about how do I do this traditionally. And for me, and as you would find speaking to lots of authors, every author is different. But for me, there were far more gains for me, far more control over what I was doing, and far more opportunity for revenue by being independently published.
Okay. Okay. And what was that process like for you? Was it generally pretty painless? Was it gut-wrenching? What was that like?
Yeah, it was. The process itself was excellent. Yeah, I enjoyed the process, and I guess that's because I respond well to give me a list of tasks to do and I will do it. So one of my values is to be outrageously efficient. So I like the dopamine hit for ticking something off on a list. So give me a list, and I'll be quite happy to do it. When it became gut-wrenching, that is such a good word to use to describe it, was when I actually released it. Because up until then, it had just been my little project that I had been working on that no one else had read other than my editor. And then I suddenly thought, oh, and if I can use an expression we would use here in Australia, I hope it resonates okay with your audience. It was like hanging your undies out in the street. You know, it was like stringing up a washing line and putting all your underwear up in the front. It felt really, and interestingly for me, with a background in sports psychology, I went through all but what will other people think? What if other people don't like it? So I had a little stern conversation with myself as I worked my way through all of that, and then released it. And what do you know? People liked it, and it's done well. And so then I got curious about the process. And so now with this last book that I've done, I've gone from a process where I was basically, I talked to my book coach about the conveyor belt she put me on, but I say it's a lovely conveyor belt, like it was like had sheepskin lining kind of thing. It was a lovely place to be. But now I can write a whole book. I don't have to talk to my family about it every single day. You know, like one of my family members, I said, "Oh, my book's coming out," and he said, "Mum, you didn't even tell me you were writing a book." I went, I know." So it's become a much easier process. And so I still use support where I need it. I definitely need. I think every author needs an editor. I think that's a really important part of the process. But a lot of the rest of it, I've worked out how to do that myself. So it's now that I know how to do it, it's almost become a little bit of an addiction. So there's definitely it's much easier to do than I thought. So if anyone out is listening and has thought about writing a book, maybe mine is just one path, but maybe that's something for you to think about.
Let me hang on the TED Talk for a second. How did that come to be? How did you, because in my head, it's like TED Talk, whoa. How
Yeah.
did you get picked, or how did you enable yourself to be part of the TED Talk?
So and I should clarify, it was a TEDx talk.
Mhm.
So TEDx came to our, which is slightly different to TED. So the there has been two in my city, two, maybe three TEDx events over the last couple of years. And so there was I'd been to the first one here, and I'd been a follower of TED Talks like many people have forever. And then there was a call for speakers. So I applied, and then I was interviewed a few times. And it was interesting because and I don't talk about this a lot, but I'm very happy to, the discussion around what the topic would be, there was some conjecture about that, because what I wanted to speak about and what the organizers wanted me to speak about were different things. It's their gig, it's their conference. So I then got to a juncture of, well, do you want to do this or not? And I did want to do it. So but that was an interesting lesson for me, because I think, had it not been for that TEDx experience of speaking on something that I wasn't, it's a part of my work and it's something that I believe in, but it wasn't like what I thought my TEDx talk would be. You know, you kind of go, this will be my signature moment. So I think if that hadn't happened, I never would have written The Elite. So
Interesting.
yeah, and I think that's I mean, gosh, that's the message that I'm always talking to athletes about, is it's not so much what happens to us, it's what we do with it that becomes important. So you're probably picking up on my vibe around the TEDx talk is, I'll be honest and say, I didn't love it. And it was fine, but it wasn't what I thought that TEDx experience would be for me. Which is why I don't particularly promote it or any of those sorts of things. And now everyone's going to go, now I have to go and watch it because maybe anyway. But yeah, it was an interesting process for me, because I think in having that experience and going, well, I was a little bit disappointed with that experience. So then I turned it into a complete career change for me. And I think that's one of the things for us to be open to, is that when something in our career doesn't go the way we hoped or the way we planned, how can you then turn that into an opportunity for yourself? But it's okay to kind of sit back and have to dust yourself off initially, because I was going to say initially I was like, oh, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. And, you know, that stung for a little while. But then I went, okay, what can I do now? And then it became obvious.
Joe, I love your perspective on so many things. It's just, it's really, really awesome. Really awesome.
Thank you.
So I am running a little short on time, but one thing I do like to do when I'm speaking with someone is I like to give them the opportunity to talk about a cause they believe in, a project they're working on. So I'd like to extend that opportunity to you. If there's something you'd like to discuss, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. So I guess what I might introduce is a program that's running here in Australia that I have a bit of an involvement with. I'm an ambassador for, and I think it will connect with a lot of your audience, because particularly those who have an affinity with defence and with the military. So there's a fantastic organisation here in Australia that's called Brothers and Books. And it was set up by a wonderful major in the Australian Army who had a back injury, and unfortunately that injury placed him on his back for 12 months. And he knew that was probably not going to go so well. You know, if any of us can imagine what it'd be like to lie, some of us might go, I'd like to lie in bed all day, but I don't know if I'd like to do it for a year. So he decided that his best strategy moving forward would be to read. So bibliotherapy is what he took on. So he took it very seriously. So he'd set the alarm for 5 in the morning and he would read all day. Since then, he's now recovered. He's got an amazing recovery that he's had physically. But what he now does, what he's now left defence, but he's set up book libraries and it started off with for defence personnel. So he will go into different areas in communities, and now he goes into police stations and fire stations and all sorts of places, and sets up community book libraries, which don't work like a conventional library, because you literally go up to the cupboard and go, oh, that book looks good, and you take a book, and then you might bring it back or you might not. Like, there's no record keeping like you would have in a normal library. But his mantra is about making reading cool again. And I really love seeing what that's doing, particularly, his target audience is many, particularly men like himself. But everyone loves the libraries. But it's nice to see people reading and talking about books and so forth. So that's a program that I really appreciate here in Australia. I don't know if you've got something similar in the States, so maybe I might have to tell Dylan to expand his libraries. But I think he's got 50 or 60 libraries now in Australia, and he's only been going for a fairly short period of time. So they do lots of fundraisers and readathons and all sorts of things. But all the funds go back to the libraries and then back to legacy as well, which is an important cause here in Australia.
Awesome. That is incredible. Great story. We have something similar, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. They're like these little, they almost look like giant birdhouses, they might be like yay big. And you open it up and it might hold maybe 30 books. And like that, you take a book and you might bring it back. You might bring different books from home and put them in.
Yes.
So it's a really, really cool idea. My kids took advantage of that, especially during COVID. We hit up a couple of those.
What a great way to share reading and to share books.
Absolutely. Joe, it's been absolutely awesome speaking with you on Time We Discuss and learning what it's like to be a sports psychologist.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for popping in the studio. My name is Dan, and this is Time We Discuss. I really enjoyed speaking with Joe today, and I hope you enjoyed the time too. Make sure you check the links in the description to learn more. If there's a profession they want me to cover, add a comment and I'll find that person for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. That'll do it. See you next time on Time We Discuss.